All right, we're going to be covering the cerebrum. This might be a long video. When we talk about the cerebrum is going to have two cerebral hemispheres. So you can see a cerebral hemisphere here and there. When we turn this over, this would be called your right cerebral hemisphere and your left cerebral hemisphere. We have two cerebral hemispheres. Now, when we talk about cerebral hemispheres, most people are going to be left hemisphere dominant. If you're right-handed, you use primarily your left cerebral hemisphere. Even if you are left-handed, 64% of your left-handed individuals are left hemisphere dominant. And that's mostly because most left-handed individuals, if you're left-handed, most left-handed individuals are going to write like this, opposed to writing up and down. So you can figure out which hemisphere you're dominant in if you're left-handed. If you hold your pencil like this and you're left-handed, then you're right hemisphere dominant. But if you're left-handed and you do this twist, then you are going to be left hemisphere dominant, because going like this is the same as writing with your right hand. So we do have two cerebral hemispheres. Now, when we look at the cerebral hemispheres, there is a deep depression that you can see right here. This deep depression is called your longitudinal fissure. Fissure is a deep depression. So if I were taking a scalpel and was going to try to cut the brain in half, which I've actually dissected brains before, you would have to place your scalpel pretty much like about this much in, and then you have to cut through a structure known as the corpus callosum, which is this section right here, which connects the two cerebral hemispheres. So this is the corpus callosum. I always think of corpus means body, like a corpse, and then callosum, I think of a callus. This is actually a really hard structure. So that's how the two cerebral hemispheres are connected. Now, when you look at your cerebral hemispheres, you can see that there's also these shallow depressions. These are going to be called sulcuses, and we're going to name a couple of sulcuses. And then the swelling areas that's convoluted, which means twisted, is called your gyri or gyrus. So we're going to talk about the anatomy of the cerebrum. So we're going to talk about the cerebral hemispheres, the sulcuses that are involved. Also, we're going to talk about the lobes. This is the anterior section here. This is your frontal lobe. In the back right here, behind this G, is your parietal lobe. And in the very back is your occipital lobe. And then when you're looking at it from the side, this would be your temporal lobe. So we have to have division markers to divide it. So when we talk about the cerebrum, you would say that there are two cerebral hemispheres. When talking about cerebral hemisphere, everyone has a hemisphere dominant or hemisphere dominance. Most people are going to be left hemisphere dominance. %90 of right-handed individuals are left hemisphere dominant, and 64% of your left-handed individuals are left hemisphere dominants. All right, the corpus callosum. Okay, not only does your corpus callosum connect your cerebral hemispheres, it's going to contain lots of nerve fibers so that your hemispheres can communicate. All right, gyri, gyrus. These are raised surface convolutions. These are going to be the worm-like structures that are raised. Convolutions means twisted or coiled. Okay, when you look at the cerebral hemispheres, you're going to see sulcuses. These are shallow grooves. You're going to see fissures that we're going to label, and you're going to have to know their names. These are going to be your deep grooves. And you're going to have your lobes. There are going to be 5 cerebral lobes. Let me use a different paper. Your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe, and your insula. This is the lobe that is deep, that is not seen on my models. All right, we're going to color coordinate or color code a picture of our brain. The first one I want to do is this picture. You can print these out. All right, so I'm going to use some highlighters and color code these so we can talk about special fissures and special sulcuses that you'll need to know and what they divide. I'm going to use green and blue, 2 shades of blue. I'm also going to use red. I'm going to use pink. That's a light enough color. If not, I will use this color pink. And I'm going to use my orange. So we are going to talk about sulcuses and fissures. So the first thing is when you have these convoluted structures, so this is a left hemisphere. This is what a brain would look like. So basically we're going over that. This will help you in anatomy lab as well. The first thing that you always need to find is the sulcus, which I'm going to highlight in black, that divides your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. This is the first sulcus that you need to know. This is called your central sulcus. Your central sulcus is what's used as your anatomical dividing line to divide your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. Your central sulcus. Now we have another sulcus, which we're going to draw down the back, starting right here. This sulcus is an important sulcus because it divides your parietal lobe from your occipital lobe. So, to review, a sulcus is a shallow groove. So your sulcuses are going to be used to divide your 5 lobes. Parieto, occipital, sulcus. Now, we also have deep depressions, which are called fissures. So we are talking about the cerebrum, but when we look at this, we can also see the cerebellum. So, a deep depression that divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum is a fissure. So we're going to go ahead and label this. The fissure is going to be a deep depression, which you can't really see right here, but you can draw it and it'll help you understand it in case you get it on a test question. To divide the cerebrum from the cerebellum, you would use the transverse fissure. And the reason it's called the transverse fissure is when you're looking at two cerebral hemispheres like this, this is your transverse fissure. It divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Now, you have another fissure that is located right here. This is a deep depression. This is called your lateral fissure. These are your anatomical landmarks that help you divide your lobes. So now that I've got my central sulcus, my parietal occipital sulcus, my transverse fissure, and my lateral fissure, I can basically color code my lobes. You can use any colors that you can find as long as they're different. Now, I will say for the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, I want you to use the colors blue and red. So you'll see why here in a moment. I'm using a darker color blue, and then I'm going to find a lighter color blue. Not as light as I would like it to be. Let's see if I can find a lighter color. There's a good one. There is a reason why these are going to be color coded for later. We even have a model that is going to mimic this, and they're even color coded the same way. So I'm using a lighter blue and a darker blue, and there is a reason. Your occipital lobe is another color. I'm going to color it, and then I am going to label it. All right, so when we talk about the cerebrum, A sulcus is going to be a shallow groove. A fissure is going to be a deep groove. Now, when we talk about the cerebrum, and this is going to be the cerebrum is going to have 5 lobes, which are going to be color-coded on this picture. Now, the first lobe that we're going to talk about is all of the pink, including the red. This is your frontal lobe. Now, when we do the safety pin cycle, I always use red for motor neurons. That's going to come into handy when we color code the frontal lobe. So our frontal lobe is going to be responsible for all motor. Anything that's motor related is going to come from your frontal lobe. So there's your frontal lobe. Now, this part of the frontal lobe that is special, it's all part of the frontal lobe, has a special name. This is called your precentral gyri. So the precentral gyri is a very important structure. A gyri is the name of these raised outer portion of the brain that's convoluted. Well, this one is in front of the central sulcus. So I'm going to put a star by it. This is called your precentral gyri or gyrus. It is part of the frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe is going to extend anterior to the central sulcus all the way to the front this way. That is your frontal lobe. Now your frontal lobe is going to be pink and variations of colors of red because it's going to control all motor functions. Now, blue. Anytime we did the safety pin cycle, we talked about blue as being sensory. Well, this area is the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe extends posterior to the central sulcus, but anterior to the parietal occipital sulcus, and it's blue because it's going to be involved with most of your sensory. Now, in front of the central sulcus is your precentral gyri. Pre means before. So the special area that we labeled, or that we did a different color of blue, this is going to be known as your postcentral gyri. Post means after. Central is pertaining to the central sulcus, and gyri is the raised portion of the cerebrum. Now, all of this is going to be your parietal lobe. So on the test, I might ask you, how do you divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? The answer would be the central sulcus. Now, how do you divide the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe? Your answer would be the parietal occipital sulcus. This is the anatomical landmark that divides the lobes. So in the back, this is known as your occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is going to start posterior or after the parietal occipital sulcus. Now, when we talked about the transverse fissure, the transverse fissure is going to divide the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So technically, we could label the cerebellum. We could also label the brainstem. But those are divisions. So we're going over the cerebrum. All right, the lateral fissure. The lateral fissure extends from anteriorly along the side all the way to the back. So this one actually is going to divide the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So this is your temporal lobe. Now these are different colors because they're going to have different jobs. Now we know motor is red and we know sensory is blue. The occipital lobe and the temporal lobe are going to have different functions. Now the lobe that you cannot see is the insula. If you removed the temporal lobe out of the way, you would see the fifth lobe. So I'm just going to put a star right here and I'm going to put the insula. The insula is the fifth lobe. This is the lobe that is deep. It cannot be seen. So there are 5 lobes. Your frontal lobe, which is going to be involved with motor. Your parietal lobe, which is going to be involved with sensory for now, that's all we're going to say. The occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and you have the insula. Now, if we did an internal view, you could also see everything. So we're going to do an internal view as well because you need to know them. You need to know how they're divided. So we can do the same exact structures, but now you're looking at a left cerebral hemisphere. This is a left cerebral hemisphere, but you can see all of the lobes. The frontal lobe, you have to find the central sulcus, so this would be the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. Of course you can't see the temporal lobe, but you can see the corpus callosum, which connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So, all right, my first question to you would be, how do you divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? You should be able to answer these kind of questions for the test. So everything here is considered to be part of the frontal lobe. So how do you divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? How do you divide the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe? How do you divide the cerebrum from the cerebellum? All right, so the first thing, how do you divide the cerebrum from the cerebellum? The answer should be transverse fissure. How do you divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? Central sulcus. What is the name of the gyri anterior to the central sulcus named? Precentral gyri. What is the name of the sulcus or the gyri behind the central sulcus in the parietal lobe? Postcentral gyri. What are the 5 lobes of the cerebrum? The frontal lobe. I can see that on this view. The occipital lobe. I can see it on this view. The parietal lobe, I can see it as well. What lobes can you not see on this view? The answers would be the temporal lobe and the insula. You cannot see the insula. So this is the lobes of the cerebrum on an internal view. Now what we can see is the corpus callosum. So we are going to label the corpus callosum. Let me find a color I want to use. The corpus callosum. So when we talked about the corpus callosum is the structure that connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres, and it allows for the cerebral hemispheres to communicate. That is part of the cerebrum, the corpus callosum. It's important to understand. Now, we're not exactly done with the cerebrum, so we're still talking about the cerebrum. We're just looking at an internal view. So, anytime you say cerebrums, you should know your sulcuses, you should know your fissures, but you should also understand the lobes. So we looked at a frontal section of the cerebrum before. So this is a frontal section of the brain. This represents your left and right cerebral hemisphere. So if this is a frontal lobe, we would say that this is your left cerebral hemisphere. Actually, let's put right because we're looking at it brain. So we could say this is the right cerebral hemisphere. And over here, this is the left cerebral hemisphere. Now, how are these connected to each other? How is the right and left cerebral hemisphere connected to each other? Well, that would be this structure right here. That would be your corpus callosum. Your corpus callosum is the structure that connects your left and right cerebral hemispheres. Now, if we looked at any of these right here, this would be a sulcus. A sulcus is a shallow groove on the brain. This raised portion of the cerebral cortex is gray matter, but these are also called gyri. A gyri. A gyri is the raised surface convolutions. This cerebral cortex is just talking about this gray matter that's here when we say cerebral cortex. This raised section is called a gyri or a gyrus. Raised surface convolutions, which just means it's coiled or worm-like. Now, here, when we talk about the cerebral hemispheres, I said that you would have to take a scalpel and place it into this fissure right here in order to cut through the corpus callosum, and then you'd have to cut through the diencephalon in order to divide the brain into left and right cerebral hemispheres. So literally, you're looking at a frontal view. If we cut it in half right here, cut it in front, that's a frontal view. We would just basically cut this whole first half off. Now, of course, this would be a piece that is missing the cerebellum, but the fissure that's on top that we talked about, which is right here, is called the longitudinal fissures. And you would have to take a scalpel and place it here and cut through the corpus callosum. So this is called your longitudinal fissure. It's found between two cerebral hemispheres. You can also see it in the back. That's the longitudinal fissure, which is here. This would be the transverse fissure. And then if you turned it sideways, this is the lateral fissure. So know where your fissures are and what they do and where they're at. So this is going to be our longitudinal fissure. And the definition of a fissure is a deep groove. You can see that this is a deep groove between the two cerebral hemispheres. So those are the pictures that really are going to go with our notes. Pictures are fair game for the test. Pre-central gyri and post-central gyri are important gyri that you'll need to understand. So we have 5 cerebral lobes. Questions that you might see on the test. What divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe anatomically? You should say the central sulcus. What divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe? Parietal occipital sulcus. What divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe? The lateral fissure. Now the insula you can't see. So important sulcuses to know would be your central sulcus, your parieto-occipital sulcus, and then we had fissures. This is a good way to review the longitudinal fissure, the transverse fissure, and the lateral fissure. So we're going to go over functions of cerebral lobes. Now, I've color-coded most of them. This is just an overview. All right, we started out with our frontal lobe. Now, what color was our frontal lobe? Our frontal lobe was pink and red. So our frontal lobe is going to have a special structure, the precentral gyri, which is going to be something that we talk about. But other than that, it was pink and red. Now, when we've learned the safety pin cycle, I've always done motor as red. So your frontal lobe's major job is motor functions. That means that motor neurons are going to rise from the frontal lobe. These are going to help you plan and execute movements. It's going to help you move your eyes. That's a plus sign. Plan and plan and execute movements. So I always do the frontal lobe. That marker's gonna be bad. There it is. Plan and execute movements. Now most of your planning and executing of movements is gonna come from the precentral gyri. It's also gonna give us muscle memory. If I ask you how to swing a golf club and you've done it, you could mimic it for me. Muscle memory. What I mean by muscle memory is muscle memory movement. How do you flip a quarter? Like this. So, muscle memory, how to do things. If I ask you how to shoot a basketball, you use your frontal lobe and you basically mimic shooting a basketball. That's muscle memory movement. But you also have higher mental functions that come from your frontal lobe. Higher mental functions that come from your frontal lobe is going to be your personality. So if you don't like somebody, you don't like their brain, you don't like their frontal lobe. It's also going to control your behavior if you're a good boy or a bad girl. Higher mental functions. Your conscience, if you think it's okay to cheat on a test or steal from someone, that's all from the frontal lobe. So this gets developed when you're a child. So if you don't like someone's personality, they didn't have good things that build their frontal lobe. Okay, now your second lobe, your parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe, what color did I use? I used blue. So this has your postcentral gyri. That is the most important thing for the parietal lobe as far as location. So your parietal lobe is going to have sensory functions. When I say sensory functions, it's basically going to help you process and integrate sensory sensations. Now, we have to be specific on here. This is going to be what we call our general senses. So when you say general senses, you should be able to list them off. Pain, touch, tickle, vibration. Now, general senses are on the body. So when we talk about the parietal lobe, we're going to say that these do somatosensory sensations. Body senses are going to go specifically to the postcentral gyri. Somatosensory sensations are your parietal lobe. So if I ask you, what does a hot stove feel like? You would say painful, or stepping on a sticker, or stepping on a nail. Or what does the shape of a tennis ball feel like? That is all sensations that you can feel with your hands. So your parietal lobe is sensory. So our third lobe. Our third lobe is going to be our occipital lobe. Now, our occipital lobe was a different color. It was green, and the reason it was green is it's a special sense. So our occipital lobe is going to be involved with vision. But when we say vision, it's also going to help you recognize individuals. But for now, we're just going to put vision. We're going to simplify it. Now, your fourth lobe. Your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe's involved with several things. Your temporal lobe is going to be for hearing. It's the closest one to your ears. It's going to help you with language. If you think about language, you have to listen to it. But deep in the temporal lobe, in other systems, this is going to be responsible for memory and emotions. It is deep in the temporal lobe, which we're going to go through. And then the fifth one is your insula, which is deep, which we can never see on my models that I brought home. Now, I do have other models at the lab, which I'm not able to get. The insula is involved with taste. So your taste is in your insula. So these are the functions of our cerebral lobes. Now, what we're going to be focusing on the cerebrum and the lobes is this outer gray area, which we're going to call our cerebral cortex. So we have these layers that we call our functional cerebral cortex areas. Now, I like to do a different picture, but you technically could use the picture that we've already done to do your cerebral cortex areas. You could do it here, or you could do a new one. I prefer to do a new one. So I'm going to stop this video and I'm going to color it, and then I'm going to start the cerebral cortex video.